it mean to be black in America? And when you are black, among all the issues, from racism to poverty to misogyny, which one affects your life the most? There are at least 37 million of us, sprinkled throughout the country, with some areas more seasoned than others. For racists and some misguided black leaders, blackness is generalized into religion, class, political affiliation, political ideology, sexuality, or even speech. But generalizing the black experience, and therefore how black people view and tackle American issues, ignores scores of black people who exist outside of dictated parameters. In historical study, generalizing does serve a purpose for covering large swaths of time and summing up problems that impacted a majority rather than a minority of people. But as historical study exponentially grows, seriously, you can find books on everything including butter, there's room to explore nuance. Many people believe that pointing out differences among black people is divisive, but there is value in doing so. We can't keep assuming we all want the same things or even see all the same things as problems. Perspective affects priorities. In this video, I want to look at how diverse the black experience is through 6 categories: region, occupation and education, class and income, politics and ideology, religion, and lastly, sexuality and gender identity. I want this video to serve as a foundation for past intellectual media content, so throughout the video you'll see pop-ups for relevant videos and essays, which are all linked below. So, let's get started. There were 2 distinct groups of northern and southern enslaved people, and the former group tended to have more freedom and opportunities for paid labor than their counterparts. Until 1804, when all northern states had abolished slavery, escaping slavery to the north meant going to Canada, which was a lot easier for black folks above the Mason-Dixon. Northern blacks were free from slavery over half a century before southern ones, and they had more access to education. They founded churches, and in some cities at certain times, black property owners could vote. Despite still living under immense racism, with their relative privileges, many were able to become abolitionists or advance abolitionist causes. As the 19th century continued, black people also migrated west, where race still played a role in their lives, but significantly less than their peers. Well, at least until the Compromise of 1850, when it became legal to round up any blacks alleged to be fugitive slaves so they could be returned to the South. In the post-antebellum, lynching was a more common experience in the South, and due to the gigantic southern population of blacks, was a more prominent issue than, say, labor issues of northern black factory workers. Black folks themselves also distinguish between region, as there are instances of northern blacks expressing disgust at the customs and stereotypes of their southern peers during the Great Migration. The civil rights movement and urban black unrest of the 1960s further demonstrates how region plays a prominent role in shaping black experience. When Martin Luther King Jr., the face of the impactful Selma, Alabama marches, brought his nonviolence leadership style to Chicago in 1966, it didn't go over too well. In northern cities and urban areas of the West, nonviolence ideology didn't take hold the way the Black Power movement did, and vice versa when it came to the southern communities. As for the present day, region continues to shape black perspectives and experiences. Cities across the country have rising housing costs, and black majority cities are on the rise. Places like Detroit, Baltimore, and Memphis are where resources and businesses have been impacted by deindustrialization in the 70s, white flight, and home devaluation. The U.S. cities with the largest black populations are New York and Chicago, but the South holds more than half of the black population, 22 million of us. Black people in the South have seen a flurry of changes thanks to growing immigrant populations and business relocation. A further breakdown shows that 17% of blacks live in the Northeast, another 17% live in the Midwest, and 9% live in the West. And of course, living in regions so vastly different from one another means being affected by local politics and customs. For instance, blacks in the Sun Belt, the states stretching across the South and Southwest, deal with a lot more in-your-face conservatism and even embody plenty of Sun Belt values and attitudes. Significantly impacted by voter suppression and racist politicians who rebranded themselves like George Wallace in Alabama, Southern blacks in rural areas face hella challenges in accessing quality health care and welfare. These black people also have fewer options when it comes to abortion and affordable birth control, and making matters worse, conservative Sunbelt governments tend to be stingier with their welfare programs. More differences? Rural blacks have a higher chance of early death than their peers, and SWAT deployments are more common in urban, predominantly black neighborhoods. The cost of living in rural areas is relatively low, but urban areas are more likely to provide public transportation and have a wider array of jobs and resources like fully stocked libraries with computers and internet. And region also plays a factor in political power, as black voters are concentrated in approximately 20 states, meaning black people in the other 30 states have significantly reduced political representation. And in 4 states, Florida, Kentucky, Tennessee, and Virginia, more than 1 in 5 black people are disenfranchised from felonies. Speaking of felonies, 7 of the 10 states with the highest incarceration rates are southern states with huge black populations, and 9 out of 10 are considered to be a part of the Sun Belt. A study in Missouri showed that blacks in rural areas are more likely to get the death penalty than their city-dwelling peers. All of this points to a more prevalent criminalization and incarceration of rural and southern black people, which should make prison abolition or reform a more pressing issue in those regions. But again, cultural norms of what is acceptable or typical, even views of criminals and how they are treated, affects everything. For many black folks in the South, marinated in conservative culture that takes harsh stances against drugs, sex work, or crimes for survival, such criminals deserve to be locked up. The root of most crime is lack of quality education and jobs, but education and occupation vary greatly among black folks, making concerns about both just as diverse. Did you know that 29% of black students attend predominantly white schools? For some, that means fitting in with white people and forging lifelong bonds, maybe with some occasional discomfort from a Chad or Brad or Hannah. And for others, that means hella racist experiences, desires to conform or rebel, and feelings of intense alienation. All of this factors into views on politics later in life. 46% of black students attend predominantly black schools, and another 39% attend schools deemed intensely segregated. Most are at public schools, and 46% of black students are educated in schools that fail to meet standards of the No Child Left Behind Act. Also, 42% of black students attend schools that are high poverty for their entire academic career. Depending on region, racist state governments have systematically underfunded public schools by cutting education budgets while white kids were sent to private schools to avoid integration. But as the years have gone by, black students aren't just at public schools, and they aren't always athletes. This is thanks in part to the rise of the middle class and various schools trying to keep tax exemption status. Black students attend private Catholic schools, making up 7% of the population, and private conservative Christian schools, where they make up 11% of the population. Both of these formative environments are where they come to accept or reject conservative values. Less than 1% of black students are homeschooled, and over 84% of black people hold a high school diploma, compared to just 3% in 1970. Something else to think about at the intersection of region and education is the type of history and sex education being provided. For states that still ignore the worst aspects of American history and teach abstinence rather than comprehensive sex ed, this has obvious effects, from believing racism is over and donning a Make America Great Again hat, to unprotected and unsafe sex among teens, leading to high pregnancy and STD rates. But what about higher education? 10% of all college graduates are black, and 38% of black people are earning some type of degree. Overall, 20% of black Americans have a college degree. And of course, this impacts views on college debt, if enough is amassed. For many black students who weren't educated in youth extensively on the toxic parts of capitalism in American history, their views tend to be more radical. So on to occupation. 7% of private businesses are owned by black Americans, and 4% of black people are self-employed, meaning the majority of black Americans benefit from business regulations that protect workers. Despite this, only 13% of black people belong to a union, and they're usually not in retail or general service positions. While an estimated 53% of black male teens hope for a career in sports or entertainment, black people are most likely to work in education, health service industries, and retail. And those in retail are more likely to earn poverty-level wages than their peers. 17% of the armed forces are black people, impacting views on veterans, war, and beliefs in systematic racism and classism. The armed forces tries to recruit about 184,000 new people a year, and they often target poor school districts. For black military service members and veterans, they view the prioritization of the military over education in the budget differently from, say, a black teacher, who are 7% of educators. 1 in 4 black Americans faces unemployment or underemployment, and while they could could sign themselves over to the military, various circumstances from political beliefs to disabilities to childcare stopped them from doing so. And speaking of disabilities, about 1 in 4 Black people are disabled, impacting their job prospects because of travel, accessibility, and pain management. Despite this high number of Black disabled people, their voices and issues often are overshadowed. As I've discussed in this video, classism has been a part of Black history since slavery. But here are some numbers on class differences in modern-day America that shape how Black people view politics. Only 5 Black Americans are billionaires, out of 2,153 total billionaires in the world. The Black billionaires don't delve into politics the same way white billionaires do. For instance, there are no Black Koch brothers using their money to change the nature of politics and democracy. Just 1 in 50 Black families are millionaires compared to 1 in 7 white families. These billionaires and millionaires are the most likely to be fiscally conservative, meaning they're anti-welfare and benefit from huge tax cuts on the wealthy. They may or may not openly claim to be Republican, but many do believe in the bootstrap narrative when it comes to the voting booth. Just 10% of Black people earn $100,000 or more a year, and while that sounds like a lot of money, they are considered to be middle class. Roughly 45% of the Black population earns between $42,000 and $126,000 a year, making them middle class. Depending on region, this income may not go far due to the cost of living. Meanwhile, 28% of Black Americans live at or below the poverty line, meaning about 1 in 4 Black Americans live in poverty. These are the folks who are most likely to desire and prioritize strong welfare programs and public resources. When it comes to housing, approximately 44% of Black people are homeowners. And out of an approximately 553,000 homeless people, 37% are Black. All of these different groups of Black people have different realities. For instance, a small medical emergency can be financially devastating for the lower class, and at most, a minor annoyance for the middle and upper classes, if quality health benefits at their jobs aren't available. When it comes to preventative health care and quality food, the wealthy have another advantage. There have long been opposing opinions and political thought and action within the Black community. We've always disagreed about how much to compromise, if at all. Perhaps we could start with the free Blacks who disagreed with how to go about the whole abolition issue in the 19th century. Or we can address the minority of post-emancipation Black people who, brainwashed from slavery, insisted that it never should have been stopped. Or we could begin with Booker T. Washington versus Du Bois. But I want to bring up Black nationalists and separatists, who have largely lived in the historical shadows of integrationists. Garveyism, via Marcus Garvey, called for Black people to unite as African descendants and for a return to Africa. Garveyites promoted pride, self-help, and solidarity, and encouraged businesses. Garvey was opposed by the Black majority, and his projects, from a newspaper to a shipping line, fell apart when he was arrested on charges of mail fraud by the Justice Department. Other Black nationalists and separatists include the Nation of Islam via Elijah Muhammad and Malcolm X, who also preached the superiority of the Black race. Though Malcolm X became an integrationist shortly before he was assassinated by Nation of Islam enemies, he still promoted Pan-Africanism. Stokely Carmichael amplified the idea of Black nationalism for a growing population of Black youth fed up with the slow-moving compromises of the civil rights movement, and various Black power groups with differing ideologies came to be. Some advocated for socialist community programs and a dismantling of capitalism. Others endorsed Black businesses and patronage as the true way, but all incorporated Pan-Africanist or Black nationalist ideas. At the opposite end of the spectrum were Black Republicans and conservatives who have their own unique history, especially since 1964, when the Republican Party began to morph into the organization it is today. The 1930s was the decade that Black voters began fleeing the Republican Party when it was still considered the party of Lincoln, because of the popularity of FDR, who was a Democrat. In 1961, a GOP strategy meeting of 670 Republicans gathered to discuss Southern political power, with Barry Goldwater delivering a keynote and promising he would bend every muscle to see that the South has a voice on everything that affects the life of the South. This new GOP wanted Dixiecrat support. As explained by Leah Wright Rigueur in The Loneliness of the Black Republican, when lots of Black people left the party in the 1960s, Black Republicans were left trying to influence and expand conservatism to include Black needs and interests. While Black Republicans expressed concern at the growing number of Southern white Dixiecrats joining the GOP, their general view was that they had to make room for themselves in the party to achieve their goals. But certain events definitely tested their resolve. The National Negro Republican Assembly aggressively supported the voting rights bill and urged white peers to do the same, insisting that doing so would show black people that Republicans supported their rights and would lead to more black voter support. While white Republicans supported the bill, they also endorsed restrictions including literacy tests, a common voting deterrent. There was so much tension that the NNRA urged the Republican National Committee Chair, Ray Bliss, to publicly support a version of the bill not marred by pandering to Southerners and right-wing extremists. Bliss refused, and this led one of the many vocal black Republicans, Jackie Robinson, to publicly wonder if Bliss was committed to rebuilding the GOP. These ideological differences throughout the 60s to now, between white Republicans and black Republicans, definitely contributed to the rise of black Democratic voters. A common lie spewed by black Republicans is that black people have been swindled and brainwashed into being Democrats, and this was the thesis of the Blexit campaign promoted by top black conservative mouthpieces. But that's not the reality. Out of 37 million black people, 16.4 million blacks voted in 2016. 8% of black voters voted for Trump, and 80% voted for Hillary. More than half of the black population did not support either candidate. A good portion of this is apathy. Another portion, suppressed voters. And the other group are black people making a conscious choice to not engage either political party. While most black people don't align themselves with modern Republicans, they do hold plenty of Republican values. For instance, 33% of black people own guns compared to 51% of whites. And these gun owners obviously view proposed gun restrictions and complete bans differently from those who don't own them. 20% of black people think abortion should never be legal, and only 30% believe abortion should always be legal. These black folks would be considered socially conservative Democrats, who are less tolerant of immigration, sexual liberation, and other hot-button issues. Social conservatives are why we can't ignore the role of religion. First of all, black Americans are the group most likely to report a formal religious affiliation, and the most likely overall to be Christian and Protestant. Black men are less religious than black women, but tend to be more religious than white women and men. Furthermore, 64% of black millennials are categorized as highly religious compared to 39% of non-black millennials. For older generations, there are larger percentages of religious people. 15% of black people attend evangelical churches, and 5% are Catholic. But did you know about 1% of the black population is Muslim? They are impacted by the Islamophobia that has been around since at least the 70s, but really kicked into overdrive after 9/11. Meanwhile, 9% of the Americans who identify as non-religious are black. They are impacted by religious expectations and agendas in politics. One survey found that 77% of black people believe that the Bible, a book with over 40 different authors, is the literal word of God, not men, compared to 57% of whites. And 51% of black respondents believe the Bible should be interpreted literally. These beliefs affect their politics and views of other black people. This category is tricky because of rampant homophobia and transphobia, but 95% of black people identify as heterosexual, and less than 0.8% of the black community is openly trans. This means that a little under 2 million black people are openly queer, and around 296,000 black people are openly trans. And remember those socially conservative Democrats we've discussed? They make up a chunk of the approximately 48% of black Americans who oppose gay marriage. Another survey said 53% of black people reported feeling that consensual homosexual relations shouldn't be legal, compared to 29% of whites. A study found that those most likely to be transphobic are Republicans, born-again Christians, or black people, even though black people are more likely to identify as trans than white people. Meanwhile, when it comes to consensual sex work, 40% of those arrested for prostitution in 2015 were black. This statistic inevitably includes people trafficked or coerced into sex work, but arguably demonstrates the number of black people who are affected by the policing of sexuality. It also demonstrates how many people use sex work to survive in a system that is inherently classist, ableist, and racist. When we talk about unifying the black community to mobilize economic and political power, are we considering all of these differences in beliefs, challenges, and circumstance? Pretty much all of us endorse black self-preservation, but who is black and who is worth preserving? What is the biggest threat? Capitalism? Communism? Gays? Homophobes? Sexual liberation? Slut-shaming? Loss of faith? Christians? Feminism? Patriarchy? Social justice warriors? Racism? This depends on individual perspective. As I've shown in this video, different groups of black people face different struggles and threats, some real, some perceived, and how they act politically, even if they consciously avoid politics, depends on how they calculate what most benefits them. When we add in gender, disability, interracial parentage, and disagreements between black people born here and immigrants, things get even more complicated. For social conservatives who hate racism, but not as much as they love homophobia and misogyny, that means aligning themselves with conservatives to oppress LGBTQ black people and black women. For black capitalists who love money, but not as much as they hate racism, war, or judgmental conservatives infringing on their hedonistic lifestyles, that means aligning with the political left. And on these groups go, some more radical or compromising than others, guided by personal priorities and dislikes, rather than every black person being on the same page. I mean, that would be pretty neat, but it's just not the reality. Blackness itself, like race, is a social construct. It's a very real one that affects our daily lives, based on skin color and parentage. But if someone asked you how to be black, any other answers would be subjective, just like the black experience and the very concept of black self-preservation.